This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. You've probably heard about microdosing, which involves taking a small sub-perceptual dose of psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin on a regular basis to ward off depression, anxiety, and chronic pain, or to optimize focus and boost energy. My guests today are James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber, authors of the new book, Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance. Jim Fadiman is a Stanford-trained research psychologist who's been working with psychedelics since the early 1960s. He popularized the concept of microdosing over a decade ago. We talk about the mechanics of and the theory behind microdosing, its promise and its limits, and how it fits into the larger psychedelic renaissance that's been flowering for most of the 21st century. We also discuss the prospects for legalization of, or at least cultural normalization, of psychedelics under the Trump administration. Here is the Reason interview with Jim Fadiman and Jordan Gruber. Jim Fadiman, Jordan Gruber, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks for letting us talk to you.
Happy to be here.
So the book is Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance. I think in a fractured America, there is a consensus that health, healing, and enhanced performance are good things. Let's start with the basics. Can you, Jim, maybe since you mainstreamed or popularized the idea of microdosing, almost 15 years ago in the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, can you explain what microdosing is?
Yes. Microdosing is taking more than once a very small amount of a classic psychedelic and some other substances to have a appropriate response in terms of healing and making the system improve. It is not a small version of a high-dose psychedelic.
Right. So, I mean, this would be, and I am vulgarizing things here because that's who I am, but so if 100 microgram tab of acid these days is kind of a standard dose, I might take 10 micrograms,
Correct.
In a given day. You have a protocol where you prefer on day one, you take the substance, you take 2 days off, you dose again on day 4 and 2 days off and continue.
Right.
Correct?
That's the most popular protocol, and there are others, but all of them have days off, both to maximize the benefit of the microdose and also to make it clear that we're not talking about a symptom-suppressing pharmaceutical. This is much more like a vitamin.
Yeah,
we
and
usually
that's
say
interesting.
that it's 1/10 to 1/20th of a standard recreational dose. So you were spot on. If 100 is that, then it's going to be between 5 or 7 and 12, let's say.
Right.
And
And you talked about the classic psychedelics. The most commonly microdose substances are LSD and psilocybin, or the active substance in magic mushrooms. What is good about them in terms of microdosing? Why do they work so well for microdosing?
Well, why they work so well is the kind of complicated answer that every few years everyone says, oh, I guess that wasn't the right theory after all. What we're interested in is, does it work? For whom and for what kinds of situations or uses or conditions? And for that, we have, we just wrote a 300-page book summarizing maybe 10,000 reports.
Yeah,
So
and these reports range from write-ups in scientific journals to kind of anecdotal experiences on Reddit and posted other places, right? So when you say reports, that you're kind of casting a wide net for people who talk about their experiences with these substances. And, some have good experiences, some have bad experiences, but that's the data set that you're working with.
The data set is all the information that's available, and information starts with people having experiences. Eventually, it attracts the interest of researchers, and they do it their way, which gives you a very different set of data points. We use all the information that's available.
Yeah.
What did happen was when Jim started paying attention to microdosing, he asked people around here in Silicon Valley if they might be interested, and would let him know. And he started getting these reports, and then he started speaking more about it and writing about it. And then more reports came in. So it was like a snowball or a virtuous
Right.
circle that just kept building and building. So he got a lot of reports coming in. And then, like you said, every place else we can find them, from Real Science to Reddit to wherever.
Jim, can you recap the story of how you first kind of encountered microdosing and why you thought this was a particular method of, of using these substances to heal and to enhance and for better health?
Well, in about 30 years, there will be a sanitized version of the truth. So while we can still do the truth, it was all inadvertent and mistakes and doing it wrong.
Yeah.
So Robert Forte, Forte, one of the secret magic people in the psychedelic world, and I had lunch in Santa Cruz, and he said Albert Hoffman, uses very low doses of psychedelics.
And Hoffman, of course, the inventor
Inventor
of
of
LSD. Yeah.
Hoffman was then in his 90s, and he uses it. He said, to think and to take. It helped him when he was taking walks in the wood. And I thought, having spent 40 years looking at the high doses of transcendence, finding out your God, and anacondas eating you alive, and all that exciting stuff, I couldn't have cared less. However, the universe said, you spent enough time at the top. Let's have you work the bottom floor for a while. And I had some friends who, in Santa Cruz, California, if you say there's a new way to use psychedelics, they say, just tell me how much. So I had some reports at 10 micrograms, and people said, that really felt good. Not only that, they said, this is now the second day. I feel maybe as good as before. First discovery, 2-day effect, meaning a psychedelic microdose has already left the body, and the body does not return immediately to normal. It keeps the benefits. And I started basically asking people to write down what they were experiencing. And then a wonderful guy in Chicago said to me, hey, why don't we just send a bunch of microdoses to people all over the country, and we'll send pads and pens with it, and you'll get a lot of data. And I said, you're asking me to mail out illegal drugs with my name as the return address? He said, no, I'll send them back. So I got reports from all over the country, from people in Hawaii. My favorite was a woman that said, it has cured a condition which has been incurable for years. Every time I come back from Burning Man, I go into a deep depression. And with microdosing, I didn't. So I was getting the kind of information you can't possibly get from a scientific study.
Right.
And expanded from there. And so we have had my personal intake of reports to me of 51 countries. And we have other data sources. So we're up to around 81 countries who have reported in with microdosing effects. It is a worldwide interest.
Yeah. Jordan, how did you start microdosing?
Jim and I have been friends since around 1990, when I met him at a psychedelics conference. And so soon after he learned about it, in 2009, he told me about it. I at the time had an office in downtown Palo Alto, and I stuck to his protocol very, very closely. I was very conservative. I didn't want a client walking in, and that went fine. And then I found that I liked it, and that it was valuable, and there wasn't anything particularly wrong with me physically or mentally, medically wise. But in terms of the enhanced performance part, that was obvious right away. Long periods of focus, workouts at the gym, all that stuff was happening. And so we just, I started really back around 2010.
I love the discussion of it as a vitamin, because these are, the phrase that comes up, or the terms are sub-threshold or sub-perceptual. So you're not, you take the microdose, and it's not like you're tripping or anything close to that, right? So how do you know that it's in your system?
Well, it's sub-threshold, meaning sub-psychedelic threshold.
Yeah.
Which is you don't have any psychedelic effects. As one person who'd been like 8 years of microdosing, she said, the only way anyone would know I'm microdosing is they might notice that I've turned the light down on my computer a little bit. So we're not talking about anything that's disruptive of any personal life or anyone else noticing. So it has filled into the culture kind of fairly easily.
Yeah.
And it is not, and this is only true, I only have to say this for people with high dose psychedelic experiences. It is not a little teeny high dose.
Right.
It is its own world.
Yeah.
In fact, one interesting way of thinking about it is that most of what people have done with psychedelics that we know of is really a kind of overdose. While this broad, wide path of benefits, physical and mental and emotional, and
Mhm.
talking to people, getting to know your own selves better, that's the real valuable dose. And it should also be said that Jim's word sub-perceptual stuck. Most people use it or sub-perceptual, but it's not really true because you almost always know if you're on a microdose, but it's a very minor thing. It's more like you're on coffee or something like that.
Yeah.
People basically say, I look forward to microdosing days.
Yeah.
But they're going to do their normal, play with the kids before they go to school and drive to
Mhm.
work and meetings and create things and so forth.
You have no qualms about having your ordinary day. Nobody else knows that you're on anything. You're not seeing any psychedelic visuals.
Right.
You're not having any strong changes of ordinary consciousness. And for me, for example, if I'm on 8 or 9 micrograms, it's a microdose of LSD. If I'm on 10, 11, 12, it really isn't anymore. And things start
Mhm.
happening and I get
Yeah.
distracted. And it can be great, but then I'm going to lose track in work and working out
Right.
and all those things. I want to keep it low.
You guys specifically say that MDMA and ketamine, which are two other psychedelic adjacent substances that are gaining in popularity and use, or at least in notoriety. Why not MDMA and ketamine? Is it just that these, they don't have any effect, or they have negative effects at the low level?
Well, they're very different. And one is they're not psychedelics.
Mhm.
One, ketamine is called a dissociative, which is you kind of separate from self, but that's about as far as you go. MDMA is a totally different substance.
Right.
In very small doses, MDMA acts more like an amphetamine than anything else.
Yeah, that's the
So
A in
that's
MDMA, right?
exactly, exactly. And ketamine at a very low dose, we're actually beginning to get some reports of people using it at low doses, but it doesn't seem to overlap with the microdose universe so far.
So we had to put out a list of what substances were in and what weren't, and what are kind of in the middle. And so we know that wherever we drew those lines, people have economic and other interests, and there will be some pushback. But some of them were easy for us, like cannabis, which I personally like. It has a whole different neuroplasticity profile. It doesn't work in the same way.
Yeah.
And nobody just has a tiny bit of cannabis and then stops and then has a little bit. So they don't use it the same way. So it's really not that appropriate.
Okay, so let's talk about what people are microdosing for, or the effects. You write in the book that depression, to alleviate depression, seems to be the overwhelming, most popular use of microdosing. How do people who are suffering from depression respond to microdosing?
Well, understand depression is it may be the most popular use of microdosing, but it's the most popular use of about 40 medications as well, because it's kind of the most
Including alcohol, probably. Yeah.
advice. However, what we know is that when people microdose, and we've really literally got hundreds of long reports because people get very happy, they say after 1 or 2 or several weeks, we don't know, different people, they have the same basic response, which is, I'm back.
Mhm.
And when they clarify that, what they're doing is they're saying, I feel the way I felt before I became depressed.
Hmm.
Understand that almost all of the people who are microdosing for depression are what are called in the medical trade treatment resistant,
Right.
which sounds like it's their fault, but what it really means is that the conventional antidepressants either have no effect or negative effects. And that's a very large percentage of people who are using these substances.
What is the
So it's
role
really
of therapy in any of this? Because, when we talk about depression, and it's true, we're kind of leaving the golden age of SSRIs, of listening to Prozac. It's funny when you said, people say, I'm back to where I was before I was depressed. I remember reading accounts and actually talking to friends of mine who have taken SSRIs, and they say it brings me to my true self rather than, masking something. But the SSRI era is kind of ending. But at its best, SSRIs were always more effective in conjunction with therapy. How does depression and microdosing and therapy kind of work together? Or are you saying,
Well, we have two,
maybe, maybe not?
we have clients who tell us about how they see it, and we have therapists who tell us about how they see it. And the clearest generalization from therapists is patients who are also microdosing do better, work faster. It's easier for them to deal with difficult material. And we do know some therapists who say, I, of course, can't recommend anything that's illegal, but if you happen to microdose several hours before therapy, I'm not going to mind.
Right.
Clients basically say, I'm getting more out of therapy. And I'm one report, for example, said the first time I microdosed, and I didn't tell my therapist, she said, for the first time in a couple of years, you're bringing up new material. So that's and she was, we think, able to bring up new material because she was less worried about whatever the therapist would think of her, and so forth and so on.
You attribute to microdosing improvements in things like you mentioned vision, you ADHD, a whole list of kind of indications. Is that, let's play devil's advocate here. It's kind of like you're saying microdosing makes everything better. Is that
Okay.
because it does, or is that because this is not
Well,
really working?
No, we're heading there.
that list, we're as amazed by that list as you are.
Yeah.
Okay, except that we know a lot of the people. Now, what we're looking at, see, again, pharmaceutical model is symptom specific. Health model is how you get the body, mind, soul, spirit working better. So there are several things which nobody ever says why, how could they possibly affect so many things? Exercise, sleep, diet, socialization, being with people. We see those as large health generators,
Right.
which help the system take care of itself.
You do, you quote, I mean, the book is extremely readable, and it's filled obviously with anecdotes as well as citations of, the relevant literature and whatnot. At one point, you quote somebody who wrote, "My college math grades are low. Could microdosing help?" And your response is, "There's no magic here." So microdosing does have its limits, right? It may make you better at concentrating or sitting down to do your homework, but it's not necessarily going to turn a career English major like me into Albert Einstein.
Now, let me give you the math one because it's fun. This is an Ivy League student who says, "I'm a math major, and it's really hard, and I'm really depressed with my work." And so he microdoses, and he then writes us. He said, "I decided to take the hardest course in the catalog, and I did just fine." And then he said in a little footnote, he said, "By the way, a number of my friends who are math majors are now microdosing." So, but that's inside the math world. Again, he wasn't saying, I then took on sculpture and here is my, my prize winning sculpture. That'd be nonsense.
I think it's important to understand that although we don't know exactly why microdosing works or psychedelics, we do know that microdosing produces neuroplasticity in a way that's a similar signal, although at a lower amplitude than large doses. We do know that at least the classic psychedelics are strong anti-inflammatories, so people tend to feel better. And we do know that microdosing tends to bring people back to a sense of equilibrium, both physically and mentally and emotionally. So if you have those sort of things going on, it becomes easier for a lot of things to get better and to excel in a lot of things. It's a lot of positive inputs all at the same time that you're trying to take advantage of.
Is there, in your experience so far, is there a limit on how long you microdose for? Do is it like taking Lipitor, but for your overall mental health? Like, yeah, it's going to be a lifelong thing, and that's fine. Or do you go through waves of it or cycles of it, or does it stop working? Does it stop being as effective after a certain point?
Okay, well, let's remember pharmaceuticals are suppressing a symptom. So they're designed for you to take them forever. Okay? Healing is different. Healing is when needed. And so what we found with microdosing is one is independently of our original work, my original work, almost every group around the planet who kind of designs programs for themselves comes up with take it over a period of 4 to 6 weeks with days off, some more, some less, and take a few weeks off in between and then decide if you want to do it again. That has turned out to be remarkably powerful. And some people find that their problem returns and they find the microdosing helpful. Other people find that the problem has been alleviated and they stop. So we really have groups. And we do have, I have a number of kind of long-term people microdosing, and they all say, eventually I only take it when it seems like a good idea. So it does not become either. It is not habit forming. It's like all psychedelics. It's anti-addictive. And what we're really looking at is what I call the risk-reward ratio, which is, are the side effects worrisome? And we know with medications, almost all medications, if you read the fine print that you don't read from the drugstore, it's full of terror stories. Microdosing is remarkable in how little it does to the system that can be measured.
That raises, my next question, which is, how do we know it's effective at all? There's a 2021 study that was co-authored by a number of people, including David Nutt and Amanda Fielding, and others who are, well known in the psychedelic field, which concluded the findings suggest that anecdotal benefits of microdosing can be explained by the placebo effect. How do we know that microdosing is not all or mostly a placebo effect? And would that be a bad thing? And actually, if it's a placebo effect, but it's working pretty well.
If it actually does nothing and it's all kind of a scam, it's going to be hard for me to explain that, say, to the group on Reddit who are the microdose subedit. It's 275,000 people, and the reports of certain kinds of healings, such as people who've been on 6, 8, 10 different antidepressants plus other therapies, who no longer are taking medication. It doesn't fit the placebo model. Of course, there's what's called a placebo effective, which is if you think something will help you, you go with it. It's kind of if you go to a restaurant and you're told the food's good, you're going to start by thinking it's good. That's the way the human body is designed, and the placebo is one of the great, fantastic things that bodies really like to heal themselves. From the cellular level on up. I am surprised with that particular study because David Nutt has a wonderful line that we quote where he says, anytime he sees something that has a list of a lot of different healing, a lot of different, modalities that he's naturally skeptical. And our point of view is, of course, that's the correct way to behave. Therefore, what you need to look at is not the theory, but the results. And we're most interested. Scientific results are very, very contrived, and that for good reasons and some bad. But what we're very most moved by is what's called real world evidence. That's when somebody who isn't involved, who doesn't have a stake in it, who's never heard the word placebo, but has, say, for example, had chronic pain because they were in a car accident 8 years ago. And they've tried everything. They've also been given everything during their rehabilitation period. So they're sophisticated. And when they say, the headaches are finally gone, it's hard for me to say, well, you just made that up. Okay. So yes, there are ways to design studies where the placebo effect can be magnified.
What do you think it'll take for, organized medicine, say, or researchers to, get, or what more information, or do we just need more studies before the more mainstream or conventional medical association or community will say, hey, you know what, like this actually seems to work pretty well, or it works as well as SSRIs do, or something like that?
Well, there are two ways. One is an endless amount of the same studies that we've already done.
Mm-hmm.
But more likely and more usual, and again, I work with a lot of different groups. And when I talk to medical students, my first question here is, how many of you have not ever had a psychedelic experience?
Mm-hmm.
And you, with a very slight smile, know exactly what's happening in that room. Is there very few hands that go up?
Mm-hmm.
So we're starting now with an educated young physician group. And they are much more interested in the research because some of them, I sometimes will say, has anyone microdosed? Not as many hands. And if the lights are low, I'll say, is anyone microdosing right now? Okay. So we're looking at the medical community is full of very curious people who come into medicine almost entirely because they would like to help humanity. They don't mind to get paid. But that's not fundamental. And that's the other way it's going to happen. The research keeps moving forward, and the people who don't want to, basically who don't like the research say it's not good, just as I somewhat diss that very probably pretty good SIBO study. So we're seeing the cultural shift.
Yeah.
Remember, no psychedelic has been, and cannabis and even alcohol, they didn't come back into use because science demonstrated anything.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we have
go ahead.
notion of science proceeds one funeral at a time. Is that Heisenberg? And then we also, I mentioned briefly, we have brain scans, we have blood flow, we have BDNF markers. All of them show microdosing very similar to macrodosing, but at a lower amplitude.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about one study by a fellow named Connor Murray, a neuroscientist, who has a clever way of showing that it's absolutely not a placebo. And in the book, he says, we can put that argument away. That's clearly not what's going on. And in addition to all of the participatory citizen science reports that we have larger scale studies like microdosing.me, where they have 8,000 people doing longitudinal studies, and they even have people not taking it, so they have a kind of control. And all of that is pretty much showing the same thing. But you will find people, somebody today told me that there's nothing I can show this person that will change their mind, that it's not all just microdosing is in the homeopathy of psychedelics, and that you don't have any real proof, and it's just anecdotes. And typically, if you talk to a medical doctor, they immediately say, "Oh, so all you've got is anecdotes." We go, "No, not really," but that's how they see it. It's hard to change minds. Yeah,
Jordan, you're trained as a doctor. You're trained as a lawyer. Can you guys are at pains to first off mention that nothing in this book you should be construed as medical advice, but it's also you talk quite forthrightly that even though some states and localities have decriminalized or legalized the use of psychedelics, at the federal level, it's illegal. Jordan, can you talk about how do people secure, a supply of things to microdose?
Well, we get asked this all the time, and as Jim will tell you, if you're older and you have absolutely no clue, you must know somebody who smokes marijuana, and they'll usually know somebody. I mean, one thing is you can grow psilocybin-containing mushrooms now a lot more easily than you could in the 70s when the McKenna put out a pamphlet on it. You can buy the spores legally, you can buy these kits, and most people can see
Mike
that.
Tyson is selling mushroom grow kits. I mean,
but
something's happening here.
Here's one that's fun. You remember Silk Road?
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
The guy who did Silk Road was imprisoned, etc. And Trump just released him. He started as a really kind of nice, quiet, smart guy, and thought maybe there would be a way for people to get things using the dark web.
Right.
And what he did, he grew some mushrooms in his small apartment, I think in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And he had bagged mushrooms, and then he put online that he was selling them. And when they started to sell, he was just ecstatic that the experiment worked. So curiously, the Silk Road, which became a remarkably horrible criminal, blah, 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 started with one guy seeing if people would buy psychedelic mushrooms from him. Now, remember, you and I are not old enough for Prohibition, but no one ever says, I don't know where anyone ever found alcohol during Prohibition.
Right. But it's hard, right? I mean, because you want to make sure that you're getting, that you're not getting wood alcohol that will make you go blind, or that you're not getting, a substance
Right.
that's either totally inert or is, adulterated with
There are
something bad.
problems. Believe me, there are problems with supply. And our book kind of does as much leaning over
Yeah,
backwards to say, don't be stupid. That's
right.
the really scary part.
And don't ask us personally because we're not going to
Right.
Yeah,
point you in that
I
direction.
can tell you as a libertarian who writes a lot about drug policy and drug culture, I get asked a
Right.
version of this question a lot, like, "Where do you get your
Exactly.
drugs?" So, that's not quite what I'm asking, but Jordan, are people still being, things like, LSD and mushrooms are, they're popular. It's hard to say the popularity is growing. Certainly, the cultural salience of them is growing, but when you look at survey data, it's not exactly clear that many more people are using them, et cetera. But more to the point, they don't seem to be a very high priority for law enforcement, particularly at the
Right.
at the small end user.
Yep.
Are people have you heard from people who have gotten in trouble for holding psychedelics while they're microdosing, or has the microdose community mostly escaped that kind of oversight?
But let me point out this is the FDA or the
DEA.
Drug Enforcement Administration asked that question. Why aren't you more interested in psychedelics? The answer you already gave is there's no money in it.
Yeah.
When you're an agent, you have a budget and you're supposed to arrest a certain amount of people, get a certain amount of stolen
Mhm.
drugs, get a certain amount, so forth. Picking on a 46-year-old philosophy student with 3 kids and goes to the Episcopal Church who has a gram of mushrooms
Mhm.
just doesn't work. And so basically, it's not of interest to law enforcement because it doesn't attract a profitable crime.
Right.
So that's the simple answer.
And also, I should say, although Jim doesn't like when I say some of it, but it's a libertarian podcast, that there's a couple of substances that are completely legal that we believe work pretty well. One is the vine component of ayahuasca, Banisterius kepi, and there's a group called Microdosing in Peru, and they've got a protocol. And we also have the Amanita muscaria mushroom, the red and white mushroom, but you have to be very careful because if you don't prepare it correctly, it will mess you up pretty severely. But there are reliable sources, and that's legal everywhere but Louisiana.
Oh, the other is the one's kind of nutty, which is peyote, major alkaloid mescaline, Schedule 1. You go to jail.
Yeah.
If you're caught with it, carrying peyote. Okay, unless you're American Indian and so forth.
Right.
Another cactus called San Pedro. Major alkaloid mescaline. I tried to find out if it could be bought, through illegal sources. So I went on Amazon and ordered it. And Morning Glory seeds is another, contains LSA, which is a slightly weaker version of LSD. Amazon carries it. And when you read the reviews, some of the reviews are, God, it was great for the back fence. I love the beauty of the Morning Glories. Others say, hey, man, this is really good stuff.
Yeah.
So the law is clumsy and was ill-informed at the beginning, and nobody has any real incentive to try and make more of the available psychedelics illegal.
So if you have a sandpaper cactus in your backyard, that's legal. But if you extract the mescaline out of it, you're in trouble.
Unless, of course, you put it in your body and then
nobody knows.
Then it's not illegal again.
Right.
Yeah.
But
well, let's take a step back and look at the bigger psychedelic revival or renaissance that, again, if the use rate numbers are not necessarily skyrocketing, and they're really not, at least according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which is, it has its problems, but it's a fairly consistent benchmark over the decades. But there's no question we're in some kind of revival of interest in psychedelics, both as on the macrodose level, as, a way of insight into our lives and, who we are and what we want to do with our lives, as well as in various kinds of pharmaceutical companies and different ways of alleviating things like PTSD, all sorts of stuff. Jim, you have been toiling in this vineyard since the early 60s. You've seen, you were there kind of at the early peak in the early 60s. Then, things got hot. By the end of the 60s, psychedelics are banned. The Controlled Substances Act comes into being. And there's a kind of long winter, at least in terms of media coverage and kind of cultural activity around psychedelics. But, over the past 20 years, we've seen this steady increase, both in underground culture as well as above ground culture, as well as in commercial culture and pharmaceuticals. What do you attribute the rebirth of interest in psychedelics to?
Well, and this is a risky moment where I'm going to question your data, because I know
Okay.
who I'm talking.
Yep.
But the data that I've been reading is there were 8 million users of psilocybin last year in the US. We know on a Google search, the curve is like exponential, and it was like 3 million searches last year for the word microdosing, not for
Right.
psychedelic.
Yeah.
So the revival is going very well in terms of people seeming to be wanting it, to be educated. We had a whole lot of, very commercially, we had 8 different publishers who were arguing over who was going to get to publish this book.
Yeah.
And that was before we finished it.
Yeah.
So it's out there.
Yeah.
It's now part of the culture. The
Well,
fact
why
that there
why
was,
do you think it is? Because it had a long
because
winter.
why do people like to smoke marijuana? Not because it's illegal.
Yeah.
They like it because the benefits feel good and the side effects don't seem to be bad. And so far, we know a lot about high-dose psychedelics. We being both the regular public and science. And science is quickly learning about microdosing. I'd say half of the research studies ever done on microdosing were done in the last year and a half.
Yeah.
Why did it take so long since we've been doing this for 10 years? Because we needed to have a number of young researchers entering various disciplines who, and I get these letters that say, I got my degree, now I can tell people what I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
So we're now also getting young people who are saying, I'm training to be a psychedelic therapist. By the time I finish my PhD, MD, whatever it is, the laws will have changed. So we're seeing the culture adjusting. And the last group that usually understands a cultural shift, we know, is Congress.
Yeah, that's for sure. Do you, what do you think about the rise in psychedelic-assisted therapy, which, and in that broad category, I would include things like ketamine therapy or MDMA therapy. Are you, how do you explain or how do you quantify the benefit that using these substances in conjunction with therapy, how does that manifest a better outcome?
Well, we talked a little bit about microdosing in psychotherapy. We don't need to go back there. It just makes whatever therapy you're using a little better. High dose psychedelics disrupt your belief system. They disrupt who you think you are, how you think you're going to be when you're not living, what your religion taught you, how does the nature of physical reality work. These are kind of big, messy topics. And when people have those topics kind of shaken loose, they often have no way to integrate what they just found. And the assisted psychotherapy is basically, can I help you make sense of this very unusual happening that happened for you? Let me give you a kind of a low example. Esalen Institute,
Right.
on the West Coast, we all know about it, has nude baths. And in the 60s, I remember several times taking friends down at Esalen for the first time to the baths. And several of them said, I didn't sleep a wink all night. And I thought it was not for taking a hot bath. It was taking a hot bath with nude people of both sexes being normal. And they had so little experience with ever seeing anyone else nude, let alone relaxed, that they had no place to put it into their system. So I guess I did a certain amount of integration of saying, okay, your life is not going to change markedly. You'll probably continue to wear clothes, but you won't be quite as rigid about some of your beliefs.
Right. Yeah, and you in an essay that I think is up on the Esalen website, which is a beautiful kind of reminiscence of your early exposure there and your experiences. You wrote that psychedelics don't have an ideology any more than ice cream has an ideology. So, could you explain that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people I know in the broad psychedelic world, but then also people who are afraid of psychedelics, think that if people have psychedelics, they're all going to start to agree with me about everything, as
Yeah.
opposed to what they seem to do is they help you break, kind of scripts or loops that you're running in your brain again and again. And they give you this moment where you can kind of redraw, whatever's going
Right.
on in your brain a little bit. But could you explain what you mean
Well,
by psychedelics not having an ideology?
okay, well, let me give you, as I usually do, an example of real people, because that's easier than my pretending to make up a theory. Um, I gave a presentation at Yale some years ago, and as I normally do, and they expected 25 people. We had the room packed at 125 undergraduates, much to the horror of my hosts. And I said, if some of you have had psychedelic experiences, can you tell me? Can you write me a note? And I had a lot of fascinating little stories, but the two that were important were two people who had a powerful religious transformation under a single use of psychedelics. One of them found her religion shallow and false and worthless and withdrew from it from a fairly insider position.
Mhm.
And the other said, my religion, it turned out, was enormously open and beneficial and fit exactly into my new belief system.
Mhm.
Both of them were from the same religion.
Wow.
That's what I mean by no ideology,
Yeah.
which is truth. I'm being kind of corny here, but truth doesn't have ideology.
Right.
Facts don't have ideology. The atomic weight of gold doesn't have an ideology. Gold has a lot of ideologies. Okay.
What we seem to find, and Paul Stamets said this, is that people who take psychedelics are nicer.
That's true.
And so, I mean, there has been some writing about the tech
Well, they're
billionaires
nicer
and
to him, maybe. I don't know, but
nicer to him. So, I mean, you could argue that it gets you more in touch with nature and with the earth as a living being, Gaia, and that the mushrooms have been cultivating us and the stoned ape theory. But I think that's all speculative, and that people don't change that much deep down who they are, certainly not politically.
Mhm. Yeah.
It'd be nice if they did and everybody, joined the Kumbaya party, but that hasn't happened yet.
Can I ask, one of the promises of psychedelics, and certainly this was part of the 60s counterculture message, was that psychedelics were going to change everything. If we turn on the world, war will disappear, all sorts of things. People will give up on the rat race and, they'll join the human race, this kind of stuff. I'm curious, do you did you believe that at the time? Do you still believe that? And then is microdosing where you're talking about, you know,
Right.
optimizing your performance so like you can grind harder while doing
Sure.
spreadsheets, are you stealing the fire, the Promethean fire of psychedelics by saying, "Hey, do a little bit of this stuff and you'll be slightly better off and you'll probably get a work bonus as well."
Well, let me come at it a way which isn't the conventional, usual, easy. Yeah, we believed in the
I have
60s and we were.
nothing but conventional and easy ways of saying things, so
Well,
thank you. Yeah.
let's remember who felt, and you get one guess. I'll give you a clue. Who felt that the people taking psychedelics were inherently dangerous to the status quo and had to be stopped?
I'm guessing it's Richard Nixon.
You got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So if Nixon thought that was true, some of us who actually were having these experiences
Mm.
also agreed.
Yeah.
It is hard to remember the group of 60s people who surrounded the Pentagon
Yeah,
with
sure.
the intention of holding hands and levitating it. They
Yeah,
were
yeah.
not successful, but they did come up with one of the iconic images of the 60s, which is a flower child putting a
Mm.
flower down the gun barrel of one
Right.
of these people who very sadly was pointing his gun at it.
Yeah.
So yes, we were very optimistic in the 60s that if people could see that they were really connected and there was no need to hate people, that they would be better.
Right.
Microdosing has a different optimism. And again, we don't normally associate this. The Dalai Lama has a suggestion. He says, if you can't do anything else, be kinder.
Yeah.
He also suggests that if you want to kill people, which you clearly do, smaller weapons. Okay, similar notion.
Yeah.
My personal kind of ideology says if people are suffering less painful, less depressed, less tired, their sex is better, they're eating better, they are less likely to be easily triggered into hostile and dangerous behaviors.
Right.
Now that's a kind of ideology based again on the reports that we get over the years that people say, since I'm no longer depressed, I notice that my sex is better, my kids like me. There's a wonderful moment. Isla Waldman, who did a wonderful book called A Really Good Day about her own microdosing. At one point, she's making breakfast. She has 4 kids. She's making breakfast. They're going off to school, and she's singing a little. And one of her kids says, "Mom, you're singing. Is this one of those drug days?"
Yeah.
There's a wine mom afternoon version of that story too, right? Where it's like, yeah, that's wonderful.
And
You guys,
the other way,
go ahead.
well, I was going to say the other way that microdosing can actually begin to produce this better world is in tandem with our other book, your Symphony of Selves, which is about healthy multiplicity and how everyone has different parts or selves or subpersonalities. When you're microdosing without any special effort, you're more aware of the self you're in, you're more able to shift and be in the right mind at the right time, and you're more likely to recognize that the person that you're with, who you normally love, is just in one of their selves that pisses you off. So we see that adding to the positive benefits for everybody who
I was just about to mention your 2020 book, Symphony of Selves, where you talk about, and I mean, the basic insight is something that I think people don't think about, but then once you articulate it, everybody kind of agrees that we have different roles, we have different versions of ourselves that we're playing depending on, things that are happening to us, where we are, how we feel, etc. And what you guys are arguing is that rather than resisting that or insisting on a single unified self that commands everything, be more like an orchestra conductor and kind of create good music among the different parts of yourself. I want to ask where does that basic insight come from? Jim, obviously you're affiliated with Esalen, which was, one of the gravitational centers of the human potential movement after World War II. Can you talk a little bit about the basis of this idea of positive multiplicity? When people think of multiple personalities or multiple selves, they think of Billy Milligan, the serial rapist, or Sybil, and you're talking about something very different, obvious<sighs> right?
Billy Milligan, serial rapist, also had a self which knew languages that other parts of his selves didn't know.
Yeah.
Okay. So he was his selves were very well divided, and he had a lot of them. And he ended up doing criminal acts and was arrested for them and so forth. He also, by the way, went to court and was exonerated because they said all of him didn't do all of that.
Right.
Okay. That's back there. The insight. It's the way I really still explain, if you want to know about multiplicity, personal multiplicity, in under a minute. Do you ever argue with yourself?
Constantly.
Everybody goes,
never. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And you say, who is the other person? And you already have given a person an immediate experience of their selves. And then you kind of can go from there, which is, it is the way we're designed. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's terrific. You don't want to be on the kind of high adrenaline where when your kid is under the wheels of a car and the 110-pound mother picks up the car, grabs the kid and puts the car down. You can't be like that all the time. Right. But you have that accessibility to different selves. And what we're saying is, if you're in the right self at the right time, you're more effective. If
And
I'm doing
Jordan, you were suggesting that microdosing, I mean, and this is not a direct time, but that microdosing allows you to kind of move among yourselves in a more productive way.
Yeah, I know that I'm more aware of which self that I'm in, and I'm more able to shift, and I'm more aware that the other people in my life are what self they're in. So one of the great benefits of the healthy selves model is that you can be more compassionate to everyone in your life because you know that this isn't all of them that did that thing that you don't have to throw people out because they've done one thing. And I will say that my understanding is that Jim was also working on selves for decades, and part of the was coming down from a trip and he realized how different he was then. And so this was a long time thing that was brewing. And, there's a lot of people who have worked on this for a long time, going back at least 100 years. And we just put it all together in one place in an easy and simple way that is kind of radical in that we do question the single self assumption. We start with that. And some of the other people who write about this still want to get you in contact with that one super spiritual self as the ultimate goal of their system. We're saying, well, let's take that out of the table and just deal with the selves you actually have and find out who they are and learn how to work with all of them and love them. And even in that book, there's a story about somebody who's a porno addict. And, you don't start out by making the porno addicted self part of you wrong. You don't call it names. You don't make it wrong. You don't try to kill it and put it away so it never comes up. You find a way to dialogue with it and maybe cut a deal with it and maybe less hours, but still a couple, things like that. So it's very pragmatic and very simple. And in some ways, it's a harder idea for a lot of people that we have multiple selves and you're not crazy. That's the way we're built. Than it is the idea that very small doses of psychedelics might actually help people in a wide variety of ways. So when you bring them together, there's some real potential.
Jim, given your kind of CV, your psychedelic CV and cultural CV, at what point did you read Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse? Because this seems, which talks about the multiplicity of the selves and
absolutely, probably. I was in graduate school in psychology, the few years before psychedelics were illegal, and I was actually doing psychedelic research. With the full disapproval of my university.
Right. Was this was Stanford?
Stanford.
Yeah.
And by day, I was a uptight, buttoned up, clean living graduate student. And by night, I was giving myself an education. And what I was giving myself an education, which was trying to understand that radical shift in ideas and the way the universe is put together that I'd experienced just before at the beginning of graduate school. Right. So Steppenwolf was definitely, along with the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Milarepa, who brought Buddhism to Tibet, a whole lot of interesting people during that period. And Steppenwolf, I actually explained it once to my undergraduate freshman psychology class as what they had to read over the break, and that there would be they have to write a small essay about some part of it as part of their final exam. It had two uses. One, I thought it was a wonderful, interesting book for undergraduates. And two, when you have 145 students with their exams, it's hard to think of anything more infinitely boring than reading the same answer or variations. So I had all these wonderful, bizarre essays that came in from Steppenwolf.
Yeah. That's amazing. I hope most of them were just agreeing with the protagonist's hatred of recorded music, which he burns a lot of pages on, right? It's a simultaneously a hyper conservative book, and you read parts of it now, and it's like we are not ready for the message that it's sending. It's so kind of forward looking. In the final few minutes we have together, I want to ask you about legalization of drugs more generally, and particularly psychedelics, because then, the psychedelic revival, the psychedelic renaissance, the cultural interest in and kind of comfort with and approval of psychedelics that's been growing, is having real effect. And we stand, on the threshold as we're talking. Donald Trump has been elected. He is, by his own, his own testimony, a teetotaler. The only drug he takes is Diet Coke. He has nominated Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the Health and Human Services Secretary, a former drug addict, a former heroin addict, who now apparently the only thing he really does is a lot of testosterone, again, by his own testimonials. But these guys may be the ones who actually deschedule or unschedule psychedelic drugs. What do you expect to happen over the next couple of years in terms of legalization? And I guess going back to one of the comments that you had earlier, Jim, is legalization that important when we're talking about psychedelics or drug culture?
Well, let's make a time moment for this particular broadcast, because we are talking while Kennedy is being grilled by
Right.
the Senate. So we will know if Kennedy becomes the head of health for the nation,
Right.
and psychedelics will continue at least at the level they're doing now, which is area by area is decriminalizing. And remember, decriminalizing doesn't say it's legal. It just says that the law has no budget to do anything about
Right.
psychedelics, which is a very, very clever way of saying if people are not doing something criminal, you let them alone.
Right.
Nobody knocks on your door and smashes your door down and says your kids have had some wine with dinner, because that's not it's quote against the law, but it's not against it doesn't cause any problem.
Right.
So as long as psychedelics are not causing problems, and that's why we like microdoses, because nobody seems to bother about them, the legalization will simply continue no matter who is in charge of health, education, and welfare. It may go more easily, but we now have people in Congress who stand up and say, my life was transformed by, and fill in the psychedelic. I think we as the government need to at least spend money on this and look at it. And where we're seeing legalization coming is actually two very different places. One is the underground, the equivalent of hippies of every generation. The other is the veterans and the Veterans Administration and the medical part of the Veterans Administration, because it's morally indefensible to say to a veteran, the chances of your committing suicide if I don't help you with psychedelics is extremely good. And I publicly am going to say to people, I would rather that you would commit suicide than we do research. That's just not tenable.
Yeah.
And that's where we're going. And irrespective of what the rest of the government is doing, the VA is going ahead and setting up research projects to determine for themselves what the hundreds of veterans who've done it on their own are telling them. So we're moving in ways independent of the legal system. And of course, the legal system can slow it down or move it up. And the other thing to keep in mind is we're one country. There are a lot of other countries who no longer feel any obligation to follow the United States in its restrictive drug laws.
So a good example of that, Canada, where there's an at-home LSD for depression study and like the equivalent of phase 3 going on. And the other point about this is that my understanding is that the people at MAPS were surprised at how well things moved along under the first Trump administration, because it was more of a laissez-faire kind of way of doing things. But there was a lot of progress, and perhaps there will be here too.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Jim Fadiman and Jordan Gruber, the authors of Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Informed Performance. Thanks so much for talking to Reason today.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Thank you.